My name is Kevin Gaines, and on behalf of the Miller Center, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the special program, Shining a Light on the Era of Integration, part of UVA's 2023 Martin Luther King Community Celebration, co-sponsored by UVA Lifetime Learning in the Office of Engagement. I want to thank Alfred Reeves and Christina Lopez Gotardi-Chow and the Miller Center AV team for making this event possible. For those joining us today, I want to encourage you to join our conversation by sending in your questions for our speakers via the chat function during this virtual event. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many civil rights activists working for social change and a more just society were motivated by a vision of beloved community, working toward a future of racial reconciliation and healing. Dr. King believed and often stated that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. Over time, Dr. King's vision of a more just and equitable society led him to oppose not only racism, but also war and poverty. Dr. King's expansive vision of a just society is under attack by the far right today. A conservative majority on the Supreme Court is reversing the gains of the rights revolution, stripping voting rights and reproductive rights, pretending an undemocratic future that looks a lot like the injustices of the past. Republican-controlled state legislatures continue passing state laws, making voting more difficult and banning teaching of history, our history of struggles against racial injustice, and in effect, banning any discussion of race and racism in K-12 classrooms. At a moment when racial discord is being promoted by far-right extremists, a growing number of whom are elected officials, hatred is spreading online. With hate crimes against African Americans and other people of color, Jews, Muslims, and LGBTQ people on the increase, it is important to revisit a time not long ago when many Americans shared Dr. King's dream of a more just, equitable future and sacrificed to make that dream a reality. In today's program, Shining a Light on the Era of Integration, we have the privilege of hearing from two members of the generation that came of age during the Civil Rights Movement, who will tell us their personal stories as high school students on Long Island in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They will reflect on the history that they weren't taught in high school of systemic racism on Long Island and in Jackson, Mississippi. They will also share their perspectives on the current controversy over state-supported attempts to censor books and classroom instruction dealing with race and sex discrimination. And now I'll introduce our speakers today. Pamela Banks is a licensed clinical psychologist and professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. She was instrumental in establishing the American Psychological Association accredited PhD program in clinical psychology at Jackson State in 1995. She received her BA from Antioch College and her master's in social work, her MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Southern Mississippi. She has held 2 gubernatorial appointments to the Mississippi Board of Psychology and chairmanship positions on committees in the Mississippi Psychological Association, the Mississippi Academy of Sciences, and the Southeastern Psychological Association. And we're also joined by Jill Lawrence. Jill Lawrence is an award-winning journalist and author of The Art of the Political Deal: How Congress Beat the Odds and Broke Through Gridlock. Lawrence is a columnist for USA Today and other publications. Previously, she was commentary editor and editorial board member at USA Today, managing editor for politics at National Journal, national political correspondent at USA Today, and national political writer at the Associated Press. She serves on the board of the nonprofit philosophy, learning, and teaching organization, Plato, promoting K-12 philosophy and ethics education to foster curiosity, critical thinking, and respectful discussion. Jill Lawrence recently published an opinion article in USA Today, which links the current culture wars over the teaching of America's history of racial oppression with the story of Dr. Banks leaving her home in Mississippi at the age of 15 to attend Lawrence's, as she put it in the article, blindingly white high school in Syosset, Long Island, during the late 1960s. Dr. Banks, Jill Lawrence, thank you for being with us today. So my first question is for Dr. Banks. Could you take us back to the moment when you and your family in Jackson, Mississippi, in the late 1960s, were discussing the idea of your leaving home to attend high school in the North, in Syosset, Long Island, in what was supposed to be an exchange program? How did you and your parents arrive at the decision for you to leave home? And tell us about your experiences of being one of only 4 African-American students in a large high school that, like Syosset, was almost entirely white. It must have been difficult at first. How did you get through that first year in such an unfamiliar environment?
Well, Kevin, that's a lot of information that I will try to give you in a very brief period of time. First of all, back in 1968, my guidance counselor at my high school and a member from the community were aware of a program sponsored by the National Urban League. And this program was called Student Transfer Educational Program. However, when they came to talk to us about it, to talk to my parents about it, our impression and understanding was that it was going to be an exchange. But that wasn't very significant. We knew that in late 1960s, it would be rare for someone to take up their experiences in one part of the country and bring them down to the deep South, especially in that particular era. So that wasn't going to, we knew that probably wasn't going to happen. But the deciding factor related to 2 events. One, 2 years prior, the same guidance counselor had given us some standardized tests, and many students scored high. My first cousin scored very high, and he was actually part of a program called A Better Chance. I'm sure people have heard of A Better Chance. And he went off to prep school to Vermont Academy, Saxons Rivers, Vermont. I also had the same offer, but my parents hesitated, and I was just 13. And I was one girl in the family, and I had one brother. So my mother was reluctant. But when the opportunity came a second time to get involved in educational experiences that would really probably take me to another level compared to what I might be exposed to at my home high school, my parents we sat and talked. And of course, my parents are spiritual and were spiritual individuals. They prayed and they talked to me. They always thought I had a pretty level head. I was a high achieving student. And so when they talked about it and had my input, they decided to make the sacrifice of letting their only girl leave all that what is familiar and near and dear to them and go off to a foreign place. I'd always been in a segregated school. I had very little contact with white people, very, very little. I didn't know anybody who was white. We met the Pearlsteins, Jane and Jim Pearlstein, a family who became my host family. And we met them only through telephone, no Zoom back in 1968, no Skyping, FaceTiming. And so, but my mother and dad liked the sound of Jane and Jim. Jane and Jim had 3 sons. And my daddy thought, you're going to go live with a family with 3 boys? But once they found out how the family had values very similar to our parents, to my parents, very high on education, very high on discipline, very high on fun, and for my family, very high in spirituality. And so my mother actually went with me to Syosset. First time she met the Pearlsteins. And my first time flying, I was 15, and we arrived, and it was very pleasant, very loving, very welcoming. And Jane was such a strong advocate for human rights and for diversity and equality, even in 1968 in an all-white environment. My mother left there feeling very comfortable, leaving her daughter with this family. And all for the purpose of improvement and betterment and opportunity. Now, granted, there were opportunities in Jackson. There are people from Jackson, Mississippi, who were in the public school system there, and they did just fine. And they've um, become national figures and made great contributions. But we didn't know what the future held for me at that time. My parents just wanted to make sure they allowed me to flourish, me to grow, me to expand my experiences and apply my talents. And so they were willing to make that sacrifice. What was it like to be in an all-white environment? Again, I'm 15. I am leaving what's very important to a 15-year-old: prom, parties. We used to have backyard parties called Wiener Roast. You just those things were very important. And here I get to Syosset, and there are no people like me. There was one other student in the STEP program who lived a block away with the family. And that student became, of course, my friend. And for a long time, we kept in contact, but not in the last 20 years, I think. Um, I got through being in Syosset with the help of my very loving family and friends back in Mississippi. People thought that was a great thing. A little boy across the street, there was a little article published when I came home once, and he said, Pamela Gipson is coming to town. He had a little newspaper with my picture in it. And so that was kind of, people were very happy that I was away and doing well. So that support from Mississippi helped me, but also prayer and the very supportive family of the Pearlsteins, because I was accepted as a member of the family. And as I said in that article that Jill wrote, some people thought I was the maid, but I was not. I was a member of the family. Jane and Jim had 3 sons, and I was the daughter. And even at her memorial service a few years back, that was my uh, testimony to the family that I was Jane's daughter. And there were people there who kind of said, "You were who?" Because they maybe didn't know, didn't understand, but I was very much accepted in that family and stayed in contact with Jane until she passed away.
It's really it's fascinating to me that you not only had the support of the Pearlsteins, the host family that you stayed with, but you also had the support of your own community in Jackson, Mississippi, that you were going away. It seemed that they were very proud of you, and that you were representing them well.
Yes, yes. And when we'd come home, there would be parties for me at a community center, and that way I got to see all the people from my high school, because I missed those people. I'd gone to school with them, some from first grade on, and so it was always a good time to come home. My mother would have big meals, everything that I liked, she prepared. They just encouraged me because they knew that I was stepping out into a territory that was unknown to them. They hadn't experienced it, but we kind of took a leap of faith. The people in Syosset, in terms of my friends, there were many people who were very friendly toward me. Um, I don't remember any hostility in Syosset. I just remember just not being in a particular circle, or I might not have been invited to something. But John Pearlstein was my age, and so I oftentimes kind of trail along with him. And Jane, they threw a big party for me in Syosset. I was decorated as a gift box, a gift to Syosset. And in a sense, I was also going to help them grow and be exposed to someone who was culturally different. And that was, some people like that. People like Jill probably liked seeing something different in their community. And so I think I did well in terms of my interactions. My biggest obstacle was finding a church for worship services.
Mm.
And so I first attended an all-white church in Syosset, and it wasn't just what I was accustomed to. So Jane and Jim started searching, and there was a church in Oyster Bay that I attended for a while, and then I ended up in a church back near Old Westbury, as I recall. And they made sure I got to church because my parents were active in our church. They were leaders in our church, and that was a big part of who I was. And so my involvement in worship helped sustain me because it was very lonely. I would walk. I think I said this before to Jill. I would walk through the woods to the major thoroughfare just to see cars that might have Black people in it because I wasn't seeing any Black people and not around any. So again, I'm 15. I turned 16 within 2 months of arriving in Syosset. And so I was there for the 11th and 12th grade and graduated in the year 1970, which was just a while ago.
I remember 1970. Well,
good.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for that. That was really wonderful and very, very revealing. And I want to turn now to Jill Lawrence for your remembrance of those times. You know, it's really striking that you recently connected with Dr. Banks in reporting your article. But apparently you didn't know each other while you two were at high school. And when you read the article, you really, you know, I appreciate that you don't let yourself off the hook in writing about your own naivete about racism growing up in white suburban Syosset. You describe yourself as, quote, white, privileged, and oblivious. So what was it like to witness the Southern Civil Rights Movement from that place, the overwhelmingly white suburb of Syosset?
Well, I think the operative word there is oblivious. I was young when the civil rights movement started in the South. I was, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old in elementary school. And given that there was virtually no Black population in Syosset, that, it was just a totally different culture. And, when I got old enough to be political, which was not very old, about 12, it was the Vietnam War that had everyone's attention. And a couple of years later, it was feminism. So I remember at the time that we were in high school, we shut down the school over the war to protest the Vietnam War. We marched around the school. We obviously must have had the acquiescence of the administrators, but this is what we were concerned about. And I worked at an arts camp on the North Shore of Long Island, which is very affluent. And one of the senior counselors there told me, you must read Sisterhood is Powerful. I would have been maybe 16. And so I read it, and feminism was a huge deal, even to the point that in high school, one of my big campaigns was for girls to be allowed to wear pants. They wouldn't let us wear pants even when it snowed. So I mean, those were the times, and that was the place. And it's ironic, but when I started researching this piece, a librarian at Syosset Library, who's a local historian, showed me a presentation that he and someone else had done for the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and it had a lot of what I missed. It had local newspaper articles about in 1963, a young man from the area went to the March on Washington, and he remembered one of the speeches. And no, it was not Martin Luther King's speech. It was the speech by a labor leader. It was a whole different experience. Then there was another young man who went down to work at a freedom school, and in 1964, and he was working. He got there six days after the 3 civil rights workers were killed in Philadelphia, and the school he worked at was 30 miles from where that happened. So, all this was going on, and of course, I knew nothing about it. I was trying to get through 3 years of high school in 2 years, and I, Pam and Marianne, the other Black exchange student, were pretty noticeable. I told Pamela that I remembered them, and she laughed and said, "You couldn't miss us." And that was actually true. But I didn't actually reconnect with her until now, in the midst of wondering why we didn't know anything about where we lived. It was a huge shock to find out that the Klan was operating on Long Island. Even while we were in high school, it was still there. It was a pillar of the community in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. It had alliances with real estate developers and with banks and with firehouses and local governments and schools. It was just astonishing to learn these things so belatedly. And later in my piece, I quote the current superintendent as telling everyone he had heard from so many graduates, so many alums, that they wished they'd learned more. So I think, when I finally reconnected with Pam, you can tell from what she just told us why I was in tears through half of that interview. And I was having technical problems at that point, so I could see her, but she couldn't see me. But I was just, tears rolling down my cheeks. She was talking about leaving all she knew and her mother's tears and the difficulty of letting a 15-year-old go someplace so different, so foreign, really, to where she had grown up. And I just thought, this story is so compelling, and what she did was so brave, that maybe this is a way in to this whole controversy these days, that people who wouldn't ordinarily read about it or open their minds to different points of view might actually see what we're talking about here, because we didn't know what was going on. I didn't know, and I didn't ask, and we weren't taught. And I think, Pam can speak to this, but I think the same was true of her. We were both teenagers, and everyone knows how teenagers are. They're worried about their hair. Actually, that hasn't changed at all. And, and what they're allowed to wear to school.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the time that you were in high school together in Syosset, the changes that we take for granted today in terms of, who we think of as important historical figures or important writers in American literature, those changes had not taken place yet. And so your teachers probably had very little instruction in African American history or the history of racial oppression. They probably hadn't been exposed to African American writers, and the American sort of cultural mainstream was pretty white and not very integrated, and I think that probably goes a long way to explain the nature of your education, in which Black people, as historical actors, as leaders in American history and harbingers of change, Black people were invisible in your instruction. So it's really fascinating that there are efforts now to reverse that process and to you hear a lot about Holocaust deniers, but I think what we're seeing now are a group of people, really a vocal minority, who are, I guess, slavery deniers. They just want to completely whitewash American history, and that's just it's kind of a chilling trend that we certainly should challenge and speak out against. So, turning back to Dr. Banks, you mentioned the difficulty and the sacrifice of going north and living in this white community. You had the support of your host family, but it was kind of isolating, and it was difficult. Could you just reflect on that experience and tell us how that experience, how did the civil rights movement and also your experiences at Antioch College influence your chosen career path and your personal and professional goals and your decision to live and work in the South. So I guess I'm asking, what difference did the civil rights movement and the freedom struggles of African Americans in Mississippi as well make in the choices that you made on how to live your life?
Okay, well, first of all, my co-op experiences at Antioch College actually exposed me to individuals who were truly struggling because of racial discrimination and because of a lack of opportunity, unequal opportunity. And so at Antioch, I had 4 co-op jobs, at least 4, and one was in St. Louis, Missouri, counseling Head Start mothers. Another was in Brooklyn at Woodwood School for Boys. Another one, Las Virginia's juvenile facility. So you can see I gravitated toward human services in terms of my experiences, but my final 2 were in Mississippi. One was in CDGM, which was a Head Start program, and we worked with families in Mississippi Delta. And we saw deprivation, we saw loss, we saw racism and discrimination. My final co-op job was with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. And it's there where I saw the legal side and the need to have people who could read and write and engage in critical thinking and be devoted and compassionate and passionate about equal rights. And so that exposure really helped me see that, you know, they say to whom much is given, much is required. Then I needed to make sure that I return home to help out with this struggle. As a child growing up, like I said, I was in a segregated school. I do remember segregated water fountains. I remember our zoo closing. I remember not being able to sit on a park bench. I remember that. And to this day, and Jill, don't cry, I do not know how to swim because the public pools were closed because they did not want to have blacks and whites swimming in the pool. So the pools were not integrated. And so that's one of the major reasons I don't swim today. I do have a pool, but I do not swim. And so we just saw I saw so many things that helped me make the determination that I wanted to become someone who would make a difference. And my parents' values as well as my values were to use my talents to help help someone else's life be better. And again, my parents wanted me to succeed. They wanted me to get a college education. My dad had a 6th grade education. My mother had a high school education. My dad was just a very determined worker and very productive. If he had educational opportunities, he would have become a professional, probably an engineer, because he could just figure out anything without instructions. My mother had a good business mind, and she wrote down grocery list of her guests for dinner, list of things that had to happen in her shop. She was a beautician, and she and her sister became leaders in their profession, state office holders. So I had role models who knew how to organize, who knew how to be disciplined, who knew how to interact with people, and how to lead. So and both of those, my mother and my 96-year-old aunt, were very pro civil rights. Now, neither one of them were civil rights activists, but both were in organizations that promoted civil rights. And so I saw their actions and wanted to follow in their footsteps in some ways. And again, the decision to come back home was, I saw that, and I see it even today, the brain drain on the state of Mississippi. And I just feel that we have to do things in our state that would curb that for sure. And some things are being done. Our daughter has returned to Mississippi after 12 years because she too wants to be in this state trying to make a difference.
Yeah, that's just amazing that, you know, you made quite a sacrifice in leaving home, but your parents also made a sacrifice. And I think that probably goes for a whole generation of African Americans in the civil rights era who came of age under, you know, this system, this humiliating system of Jim Crow. And, you know, we're just trying to get through that and to support their children so that they could, you know, be the best you know, that they could be and achieve their dreams. And it seems like your parents were certainly part of that generation of struggle and sacrifice. And I think we're all the beneficiary for that. Jill, in your article, you talk about your college education and decision to pursue a career in journalism. And you also go on to talk about the history that simply wasn't taught in those days, the history, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, systemic racism and white supremacy in New York, in Long Island, and really, you know, nationally, that was just not part of the conversation. You're living in an all-white suburb, Black people, with the exceptions that you mentioned of people from your town who got involved in the civil rights movement. But, you know, there's just a lot of innocence or blindness to these issues. And could you talk a little bit more about, you know, not only your college and your sort of coming of age and becoming sort of more aware of these sorts of issues, but also some of the aspects of the history of New York and Long Island. You know, a lot of people, and when teaching U.S. history, and I mentioned that there was slavery in the northern colonies and northern states, and the legacy of slavery lasted well into the 19th century in places like Rhode Island and, of course, the state of New York, students are shocked. So if you could talk a little bit about, you know, some of the things that you found out about your own history locally and in New York, I think that would be really, really fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I want to draw a parallel with is I went into journalism as a cause person, the same way that Pamela went back down south, but the cause was women's rights. And I remember consciously thinking, I will try to change this system from within, and writing articles about when the Pennsylvania legislature was trying to fix the car insurance system because women were better drivers, but paying higher rates for, you know, for insurance. And so, I mean, it was the same thing, but it was parallel. And, you know, there was just no awareness. I could tell you about the Erie Canal, which we learned all about in New York State history in 4th grade. But I did not know until I started researching this piece that in colonial times, Long Island had the highest concentration of enslaved people in the North. And even after slavery ended, you know, one thing just became succeeded by another, both very difficult in terms of race. And the federal government and local governments were all complicit in this system of residential segregation. To this day, Syosset, New York, has hardly any Black people, 0.8%, and it has 29% Asian American. So certain places become magnets for people, but Syosset did not have its first Black resident until 1964, and it was a huge production. I didn't get into it too much in my piece, but first there were first there were protests from people who didn't want this family moving in. Then there were protests from civil rights activists who insisted on having, the Black family complete the sale. And eventually that was the side that prevailed. And then what happened? Basically nothing. A Black family moved to town and nothing happened. They found serenity, according to one newspaper article. But it didn't really spread into anything. And that is the case for so many places, not just on Long Island and in New York, but across the whole country. And it's hard to believe when you read history now that the federal government was trying to make sure that Black families could not move to areas where the schools were good or, where the houses were nicer, and they couldn't get mortgages, there was redlining. And then you read investigations of the last few years that all of this is still going on, that realtors captured by secret cameras are steering people to certain kinds of neighborhoods depending on their race. That appraisers are appraising value lower at houses if they know they're owned by a Black family. In fact, the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, just signed a bunch of laws trying to get rid of this, and the Biden administration has also done some work in these areas, but it just continues and continues, and generations of wealth and generations of education have been denied. And one of the things that was so astonishing, I actually called Pamela at this point. I was finding art for the story, and the pictures of the Klan, in full regalia, but no hoods. They were showing their faces. They were pillars of the community. Those pictures, a picture of a slave cabin on Long Island, just these pictures were so powerful that I kind of suddenly realized the significance of what I was trying to say in this piece, and called her and said, beware, the pictures are just astonishing, and to think that we didn't know this was happening. In fact, there was a photograph we used of a Klan member in 2016 on Eastern Long Island. The date on the picture was November 22nd, 2016. And this was a hooded person. And what I didn't include in what I wrote was the caption from the Agence France Presse photographer. He said the man told him that they'd had something like 1,000 requests to join in the couple of weeks since Donald Trump had won the election. So there was a surge of interest, and the rest is history that we're still living.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of those listening may think of the Ku Klux Klan as a secret domestic terror organization that rampaged in the South after emancipation and during Reconstruction. But Jill, you're talking about the revival of the Klan as a national organization, and an organization that was fully open, and members of the Klan were known to the public. Members of the Klan actually ran for political office in states like Indiana and Michigan, and perhaps New York as well. And so this is the revival of the Klan, and there are photos of a Klan parade of, just sort of, masses of Klan members in their full regalia, their hoods and robes, marching through Washington, D.C. in the 1920s. And of course, the Klan, that sort of revival of the Klan declined due to political scandal. And, I guess during World War II, we were trying to sort of pull together. The nation was fighting for the survival of democracy against a dictatorship that, Nazi dictatorship that was predicated on Aryan supremacy. So there was kind of an anti-racist thrust to the fight. But as we all know, the Klan has persisted in the South, in the person of someone like David Duke, who continues to be a factor in our politics. That kind of white supremacist extremism is a factor.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I often wonder is if Pamela's parents had known that this was still happening in the North, would they have let her go? There are letters from the Klan about sponsoring firehouse events, about trying to influence school boards, letters that and documents about their connections with the financial industry and the power brokers on Long Island. And you just have to wonder, what if we had known?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and the other point I want to underscore, Jill, is your point about the role of the federal government and local governments in sort of maintaining housing segregation. And scholars of the civil rights movement used to talk about segregation in the South, that it was state sanctioned segregation. They called it de jure segregation by law. And then they used to talk about segregation in the North as de facto segregation, that, giving the impression that it just sort of happened, it just sort of evolved, and that there was no sort of legal or political series of events that caused it. But, what you're saying is that, housing segregation in the North was really the product of national policy. The federal home loan policy denied home loan support to African Americans. And of course, the banks and the real estate industry made sure that Black people, regardless of their income, could not live where they wanted to.
Right. And we can't forget the covenants. You had to sign things when you rented or leased houses in Levittown and all across the country. It spread like wildfire. Only a white person could occupy that house unless the Black person was a servant. Then if it was a domestic servant, they could live in your house.
That's right. I just want to send out another word to those joining us. Please send us your questions and add your voice to the discussion that we're having. We look forward to hearing those questions. Let me turn back to Dr. Banks. Tell us about your work experience as a psychologist, including the time that you did clinical practice and your role as a professor at Jackson State, chairing an academic department. How do you bring your life experiences to bear on your conversations with students? You're teaching and advising them.
Okay, well, a couple of things. I chose psychology for several reasons. One reason being, I guess I never thought of myself as a frontiers person, but most people that I was exposed to were in the teaching profession. And I wanted to go in a direction different from being a school teacher. And so psychology was one area of study that fascinated me greatly. And I clearly saw that two things. There were fewer people of color in clinical psychology. Just again, going in a direction where I'm the lone person. This was back in the early 80s. So there were fewer clinical psychologists who were people of color. There were tremendous mental health needs that were oftentimes ignored. Traditional psychology may not have understood the cultural considerations that are imperative in having a personal relationship between a client and the therapist. I saw mental health needs beyond just people in the Black community. I saw mental health needs as related to emotional and psychological and cognitive disturbance in lots of people, in just how they managed their interpersonal affairs and how they made decisions and how they were taking on leadership positions with rather they were influential, but their thoughts were very, very primitive and very discriminatory. And so I felt that by being exposed, kind of related to the social psych literature, having exposure and interactions with people of color as a psychologist might help break down some barriers. I have been at Jackson State University for a very long time as a professor, and with my students, I've told them about my SciOSIT story, and the take-home message to them is to broaden your horizons, to expand your knowledge base, to go in directions and through pathways that might be somewhat uncomfortable, but don't just sit down on the steps and complain and whine just because you find it kind of hard, or because it will be too challenging. run toward the challenge, and not just for self, but for what benefits that you may have in helping others. I guess I was really driven by the need to remedy problems, come up with solutions, be a part of the solutions, and not certainly definitely not be part of the problem. Um, at Jackson State University, part of my bio you mentioned was our APA accredited clinical psychology PhD program. We happen to be one of two HBCUs in the country with the accredited clinical psych PhD program. And because of that, we have added to and accomplished our goal of increasing the number of underrepresented um, minorities in the field of psychology. So we have a number of licensed clinical psychologists who have come through our program, and we're very proud of that. So again, that was part of my mission to help wherever there is some discrepancy, some needs, mental health needs for underrepresented populations to become more represented. I wanted to channel my efforts and interest in trying to make a difference once again in that regard.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's wonderful. And given the fact that a lot of the issues of access to education, are and just the struggles, emotional struggles of living in a segregated society are still very much with us. Your work and the work of your students who've gone on to professional practice is so important. Jill, in addition to your work as a journalist, you're active in a national organization that supports K-12 education and seeks to foster ethical awareness, curiosity, critical thinking, and respectful discussion. What's your response to the furor, the moral panic over teaching race and racism, and an honest accounting of the American past in classrooms? As you've written, conservative politicians and well-funded organizations are saying that so-called critical race theory harms white students, making them feel guilty about slavery and racism. So what's your response to that? How do you explain this happening? I mean, I've been teaching at the university level and sometimes, doing a lot of work with high schools in trying to make sure that their curricula in American history are updated in terms of an adequate representation of African American history. So I've been doing this work for years. I've never heard any kind of pushback like the sort that we're getting today. So if you could just talk about how you're thinking about these issues.
Well, I should start by saying that just yesterday, I read an article from National Review that Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida has rejected a new advanced placement course on African American history. And I can't, speak to what's in the course. I don't know what's in it. He basically said it has no historical justification, and it was socialism. It's in a way, it's too bad we have political campaigns to interrupt the work of governing, but that's just a symptom, a very recent symptom of things going wrong. I did a lot of delving into polling to see what was going on with actual Americans, and most people wish they knew more. And there's huge support for teaching history. There's less support for teaching current impact below high school, but there's a majority for teaching all of that in high school. So there's a huge majority for teaching the history to younger kids. I wouldn't say young kids, but certainly by high school, And, why not show people the actual articles of confederation and of secession. I'm sorry, why these states were saying they seceded, and they all said it was over. They wanted to keep slavery. It was mentioned in most of them, if not all of them. It's very clear what was going on. Why not do that? I don't think too many people have objections to that, but the fact is that this history is still not being taught, much less the continuing impact. The Erase Racism organization in New York, the most recent president, she's now the president emerita, but she mentioned to me that they used to give 20-minute workshops to educators, and they covered 400 years. And at the end, people were saying, wow, I learned a lot of new things. Now that is educators, and that is really astonishing to me and unacceptable. I think after the George Floyd murder, there was a lot of excitement in the education community, and there were curriculum discussions, and people thought there was going to be a lot of progress. And then there came a huge amount of pushback, trying to influence curriculum, exclude things from curriculum, not just about race, but about gender, sexual orientation, everything. And so we're now in the thick of a culture war about things that should be factual. And I just don't think we can fix things until we confront them. I think one of the people who's doing a really good job of helping this along is our new Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson. What she said at the arguments over affirmative action, one of the hypotheticals she used just kind of hit me in the gut about the person who's lived in North Carolina. His family's been there for 5 generations. Many of the generations have gone to that school, and he wants to honor his family's legacy and go to the University of North Carolina. And then she said, but then there was a Black person who also, his family has been in North Carolina for 5 generations, but they couldn't go to the University of North Carolina because of slavery and segregation and all the rest. And he wants to honor his family's legacy and go to the University of North Carolina. I mean, you could do the same analogy with someone whose family is white and funds the university and has a ton of money to give away. And there might be some Black families with money to give away, but as a rule, they probably don't have as much or any. And so, that's just one example that the American public might now start hearing as we move more people into all walks of life, and we have people at the highest levels who can really speak personally to this experience. And so I'm very hopeful about that. And I just feel that if people understood, and maybe this is very Pollyanna-ish, but if people understood what was happening, that they would say, oh, well, of course we've got to fix that. I mean, the Jackson water system, Pam can speak to this, decades, centuries of neglect, stories coming out that no one knew about. Bruce's Beach, a beach in Southern California that was taken 100 years ago from its Black owners because they were Black. And then in the last year or two, returned to the descendants, and the descendants are about to sell it back to LA County for $20 million. How about the Tulsa race massacre? I mean, that's another one. That 150 years ago, 100 years ago, the 100th anniversary was when a lot of people first found out about it. Me, that an entire affluent Black community was wiped out by white rioters, and at least 300 people were killed. So these are stories that hardly anyone knows. And as I mentioned in the piece, it took nearly 400 years from the arrival of the first enslaved people to get a museum of African American history. So, we have a lot of confronting and fixing to do. And I feel like if people could draw that line better, that it would really help us come to some understanding of what needs to be done. But the responses to the piece, I mean, there are people who know from their lived experience what's been happening, but they're constrained by state laws and executive orders from talking about it.
Yeah, Jill, all those things, all those events that you mentioned and many more, we should never forget that those events happened. And our role as educators is to always explain how and why they happened. And I think that that's really important for us as a democracy going forward. Wouldn't you know that as our time is drawing to an end, the questions are pouring in. So I have a question for both of you. this is from someone one of our audience, who is curious to know what kind of feedback and response both you, Jill, and Dr. Banks have had to the article. And there are more questions, but maybe we could just begin with that one.
Well, many of my friends have seen the article, and they say, "Oh, we never knew that about you." And it's funny because I didn't, I guess, have a need to share it with them as much as with students, because it's not about me. It's about trying to help people understand that you can make a difference, you can improve your life, you can expand and grow, and so that's how I've conveyed that to students, but not to my friends. They all thought, "Oh, you were always a frontiers person," and I said, well, in the most southern way, they would add. Why? I don't know what they're getting at there. I guess because I'm very, very mannerable and courteous and polite.
That's true. She is. And I mean, as a journalist, you're taught you never should be the story. And I know that Pam doesn't feel she should be the story, but I think both of us decided that our experiences were worth sharing in this instance. And I got a lot of feedback from people I know from Long Island, from different towns, people I didn't know when I was a kid, who say that, it wasn't that our parents were prejudiced or anything. It was just nobody had any choices back then in the 50s, and you just bought your house, and then what's going on here, if they even asked those questions. But a lot of people are very regretful that they didn't know more. The one I got from people who were telling about their own situation being different. For instance, someone from San Francisco whose school was very mixed, and someone from the South an older doctor who talked about his career and how he hoped he wasn't racist, and that my piece would help him realize if he was inadvertently being so. And some very heartfelt responses from people. And it's important to note that this was not every experience, but boy, it sure seems like in places like Texas, big school districts all over the country, that the same sort of thing was happening, just residential segregation and no exposure. And that was my kind of overriding sense of the responses.
Well, we are drawing close to the end of our time, and we've had a wonderful and stimulating conversation trying to shine a light on the era of integration, which also means dealing with our history in the United States and the history of racial oppression honestly. And so this is a wonderful conversation. I feel that we're only just sort of hitting our stride as the time is running out. So I want to thank you both, Jill Lawrence and Dr. Pamela Banks, for joining us today for this important program as a celebration of the holiday in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Kevin.